Chapter 7. Sked, Fluffle, and Hildegard. The Ryboltians are one of the nastiest known races to exist. They use their enormous size and brute strength to bully and intimidate anyone who crosses their path. They have huge egos and always put themselves first. They are also fiercely competitive. They gain an immense amount of sadistic pleasure from inflicting pain and misery on others. Sked obviously has some sort of genetic abnormality, because unlike his fellow Ryboltians, he detests nastiness and violence. He is a shy, 17-year-old gentle giant who hides behind a very thick beard of curly, brown hair that almost covers his entire face. Piercing through the dense facial hair like aquamarine gemstones are two of the most compassionate eyes one could possibly imagine. The rest of his body is also covered in thick, curly brown hair, giving him a permed Bigfoot meets Yeti appearance. Prior to his exile from Ryboltia, he enjoyed nothing more than smelling the multitude of colourful flowers that bloom during springtime, or watching the gold leaves of the majestic gold trees fade to silver, then bronze, as autumn took hold. He also enjoyed collecting a broad array of the beautifully coloured gemstones that littered the banks of the River Boltian, and then polishing them using no more than spit and the massive friction that his hands were capable of producing. He wondered why such an ugly race as his was rewarded with such a beautiful landscape. Unlike the rest of his breed, Sked gained no pleasure whatsoever from seeing how far one could kick a defenceless Koolaboo. Rather, he would be filled with great sadness and shame as he watched these innocent bundles of fur whistle through the air and come crashing down in agony. Why did the rest of his species feel the need to deliberately hurt and humiliate these cute, harmless little creatures? After all, Koolaboos were no larger than a soccer ball and posed no danger whatsoever to their massive 10-foot-tall Ryboltian aggressors. They slept for most of the day, and their diet consisted solely of a fast-growing, noxious, prickly weed. If anything, they did the Ryboltians a huge favour by keeping this weed under control. He felt a self-loathing for not having the courage to stand up for these defenceless creatures. Why was he so weak? Feeling sorry for them did not assist them in any way. He did not even have the courage to stand up for himself. He should have tried to defend himself the time his older brother Squelcher glued him to a tabletop with the sap from a melony tree. He did not even try to resist. He could vividly recall the cruel look of enjoyment on his brother's face as he painfully tried to free himself from its powerful bond. An hour later, he was free, but he had lost most of his thick, curly back hair in the process. Back hair is seen as a sign of great beauty by Ryboltian women. The more back hair you have, the more desirable you are as a potential mating partner. Nor did he find it funny when his parents secretly replaced his hair shampoo with frilly fruit acid. He screamed out in pain as the acid burned through his substantial mop of curly hair and removed the first layer of epidermis from his tender scalp. His screams were music to his parents' ears. Instead of telling them that he was not happy about what they'd done to him, he congratulated them on their ingenuity. He did not want to hurt their feelings. He disliked the continuous one-upmanship as well. If one Ryboltian kicked a Koolaboo 6 meters through the air, the next Ryboltian would not stop until they had reached the 7-meter mark. The competitiveness was sickening. If one Ryboltian added a room to his or her house, their neighbours on each side and across the road would add an extra 2 rooms. As a result, Ryboltians lived in massive, self-indulgent houses well beyond their requirements. These houses would easily have competed with the largest houses in Hollywood and Bel Air. However, all that mattered to them was the size of the structures. The bigger, the better. Consequently, every last one of them resembled enormous, sterile, colourless concrete compounds. They were revolting eyesores, depressing the otherwise magnificent surrounds. It was not the Ryboltians who built these monstrosities, mind you. Oh no, they were far too important, not to mention lazy, to do this sort of work. They forced another poor creature, the lentinas to do all the grunt work. Lentinas are tall, skeletally thin creatures. They have blue shimmering scales that cover their broad bean-like bodies from head to toe, and these scales protect them from the harsh sun. Despite looking fragile, they are in fact exceptionally strong and hard-working. Internally, they have a spine that resembles a tightly coiled, industrial-strength spring. It gives them the capacity to lift incredibly heavy loads. As a result of repetitive strain, many of the older lentinas' springy spines have lost their tension. Consequently, it causes them to wobble forwards and backwards awkwardly as they walk. Like the Koolabus, the lentinas are also friendly and peace-loving by nature. They are also very fearful of the Riboltians. If lentinas work too slowly, the Riboltians whip them with flexible hileli canes dipped in frilly fruit acid. Even when the lentinas work their hearts out, they receive an occasional whipping for no other reason than the Riboltians' thirst for sadistic pleasure. The lentinas do not receive any form of payment for their hard work. Instead, they are promised protection by their master from other Riboltians. Sked swore to himself that when he eventually moved out of his parents' home, he would live in a small, modest house that he would build himself. The other Riboltian boys continually teased Sked for being so effeminate. They could not understand why he favoured painting the landscape or collecting river stones over beating up a few Koolabus and lentinas, or engaging in one of their all-important who can pee the longest and farthest competitions. He always vehemently refused to partake in any activities that were cruel or nasty. As a result, he was continually heckled and bullied. Their favourite taunt was, "Sked by name, scared by nature!" The more persistent bullies loved pinning Sked down and then painting his hairy body from head to toe in the honey-like bramble nectar of an insect called the brambling bunter. They made sure to work the bramble nectar all the way down to his sensitive skin underneath. They would then release jar after jar of sweet-toothed gnawer ants onto his body and allow them to enjoy the treat. They would laugh hysterically as the pain of wayward gnawer bites would cause Sked's skin to feel as if it was on fire. The intense agony would also cause him to frantically run around, and this, in turn, would cause severe chafing to his groin region as the sticky hairs knotted and tugged. The ringleader of this sadistic group, believe it or not, was Sked's youngest brother, Brutal. So much for brotherly love. Whilst the docile, peace-loving Sked wallowed in self-pity, a 13-year-old Koolabu named Fluffle was fighting his own internal demons. He dreamed of one day standing up to his Riboltian oppressors. He stared at himself in the mirror and tried to look as ferocious as possible. He puffed out his fluffy white chest and tried his best to reveal his tiny razor-sharp teeth. Although he now looked twice his normal size, he was still no bigger than his earth cousin, the koala. His razor-sharp teeth were unfortunately way too small to push past his luscious black lips. Furthermore, the enormous brown puppy dog eyes that dominated his face betrayed him by only speaking of peace and tranquility. Even his voice lacked any real conviction. He sounded like he was talking through lungs filled with helium, and spoke so quickly that it was impossible to pick up every word. It was as if he was rapidly running out of oxygen and wanted to get in the last few words before he collapsed. So, intimidation tactics were not a viable option. He realized that if his race were to have any chance of successfully standing up to the Riboltians, it would need to be by sheer force of numbers. They outnumbered the Riboltians 100 to 1. Although their mouths were tiny, their razor-sharp teeth packed a really nasty bite. If they all attacked at the same time, it would be as devastating as a pack of piranhas attacking. He expressed these thoughts to his parents and siblings, but they were horrified at such a suggestion. His dad sternly warned him to never speak of it again. "You need to learn to accept your lot in life, Fluffle," shouted his dad. "At least you're alive and in one piece, please, son. We worry about you and your wild imagination." His dad's response simply added fuel to the fire that burned within him. He did not want to simply exist. He wanted to enjoy life. He wanted to walk the streets of Ryboltia without having to be continually vigilant and go scurrying for cover every time he spotted a Ryboltian. He did not want to spend evening after evening soaking in freezing cold ice baths to assist with the bruising that he would come home with from being kicked around like a soccer ball. With such intense conviction, it was only a matter of time before he would lose his cool and refuse to be bullied. That day arrived about 2 weeks later. A group of Ryboltian teenagers caught him unawares and told him they were going to use him for a game of Recce. The game is similar to soccer, except there are no rules. As long as you get the Kulaboo into your opponent's goals, it counts as a goal. The means by which you achieve this is completely up to the players' imaginations. Fluffle expressed his refusal to cooperate by running off as fast as he could. As the adrenaline coursed through his tiny body, he felt a huge euphoric rush. So this is what it felt like to stand up for oneself. This is what it felt like to be free. Unfortunately, his huge heart did not compensate for having tiny little legs with only 2 toes per foot. Kulaboos are not designed for speed. Moments later, he succumbed to speed wobble and fell flat on his face. A large Ryboltian teenager named Torteroo scooped him up with one quick fluid motion and put him in a sack. He then nonchalantly swung the sack containing Fluffle over one of his enormous shoulders. Fluffle was not done with yet, though. He frantically bit at the sack. In doing so, he accidentally pierced Torteroo's shoulder. Torteroo screamed out in agony as a tiny trickle of blood stained his hairy left shoulder and back. The sharp stinging pain caused him to lose his grip of the sack. It came crashing to the ground, and despite Fluffle being severely concussed, pure willpower drove him onwards. He wriggled his way out and started running for freedom once again. He got no further than 5 meters this time, as Torteroo furiously smashed him over the head with a heavy wooden baton known as a stook. Fluffle woke in agony as the rope tied around his tiny feet and ankles bit painfully into his skin. As he looked round, he felt totally disorientated because everything was upside down. It took him a moment to realize that he was now suspended head first from a thick branch of a huge gold tree. The Ryboltians laughed sadistically as they took turns whacking him with their stooks. They were treating him like a piñata and literally knocking the stuffing out of him. "Let's see who can split him open first," chuckled Torteroo. Sked, who had been peacefully working on a sketch of the landscape using a charcoal-like stick, heard the screams of pain and the laughs of joy. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Sked," his inner voice implored. "Don't get involved. This is not your fight." His enormous feet betrayed him and compelled him to follow the source of these sickening sounds. From the safety and cover of another enormous gold tree only 100 meters from the atrocity, Sked watched helplessly. Tears rolled down his hairy face. They were literally beating this poor Kulaboo to death. At least its screaming had stopped. By then, Fluffle was unconscious and barely breathing. "Let's finish him off by bathing him in a bucket of frilly fruit acid," shouted Torteroo. His delinquent companions thought it was a brilliant idea. With Fluffle hanging motionless, they lumbered off in search of a large enough bucket and a fruit-laden frilly fruit tree. As soon as they were sufficiently far away, Sked ran up to Fluffle and tried as delicately as possible to untie the rope from his tiny ankles. They were now raw to the bone and very possibly dislocated. The little chap groaned in agony. Sked tried to reassure him that he meant no harm. It made no difference really, though. Fluffle was in no state to reply, let alone argue. Having successfully untied Fluffle, Sked then ran all the way home with Fluffle cupped safely in his arms like a baby. Sked was very conscious to hide every time any creature came into view. They made it home safely. He hid Fluffle in one of the 15 underground rooms that his family had never used. Each of these rooms was dark, damp, and musty. They were also almost completely soundproof. They were built as a result of vanity and greed rather than practicality. Although the room was barely habitable, it was at least a safe shelter for the time being until the storm blew over. The storm never blew over, though. In fact, it soon turned into a full-scale hurricane. The Ryboltians spent their entire days hunting for Fluffle. They turned his discovery and capture into a huge competition. Fluffle's parents and siblings were continually tortured in repeated attempts to extract information as to his whereabouts. They truly wished that they did know his whereabouts. They were extremely concerned about what had happened to him. As each day passed, the Ryboltians became more and more frustrated. Koolaboos were indiscriminately tortured and taunted. Many of their modest houses were burnt to the ground. It took more than a month before things slowly started to simmer down. However, Sked knew that if Fluffle was to ever surface, he would be killed. So what was he to do? Despite having made an excellent physical recovery, Fluffle was starting to show signs of severe depression. He could not live underground for much longer. The isolation was driving him crazy. He hardly ate and slept most of the time. When awake, he cried like a homesick baby. He missed his family desperately. His life was now confined to living in a dark, damp, underground cage, with almost no company whatsoever. Sked tried to spend as much time with Fluffle as possible, but was also aware that if he spent too much time underground, it could cause suspicion and jeopardize both of their lives. Their interesting discussions on shared beliefs and philosophies had to be kept to a bare minimum. It was a shame, really, because both were highly intelligent and could have happily chatted for hours on end given the opportunity. The odd few minutes here and there that Sked could afford Fluffle was hardly sufficient. As a result of stress, poor Fluffle's thick white fur was starting to fall out in clumps, exposing patch after patch of delicate pale pink skin. It gave Sked his first real insight into just how tiny these creatures are when stripped down to their bare essentials. Underneath the fur lived a creature no larger than a possum. Fluffle was unaware that he would soon be sharing his underground dwelling with a 16-year-old Lentina girl named Hildegard. Despite the slight age difference, they would get on very well because they shared the same dream. A dream of freedom. Hildegard resented having to toil all day building the Ryboltians' enormous houses totally free of charge, simply to satisfy their huge egos, whilst she and her family of 14 were forced to share a one-bedroom hovel. Moving around her parents' house was like trying to negotiate your way around Grand Central Station during peak time. You had no body space whatsoever and continually knocked shoulders. Sleep time was even worse. It was like being in a can of sardines. The thought of this inequality plagued her mind constantly. The one side of town had houses the size of palaces, and their aggressive owners enjoyed the lives of kings, whilst the other side of town lived in tiny, dilapidated shanties made from leftover metal scraps, and their passive owners lived like peasants. "It's not right!" she shouted as she frantically shoved her way past her siblings, desperately trying to get to the single toilet that they all shared before anyone else beat her to the post. Hildegard's voice is slow, dry and twangy. It's really weird watching her speak because her mouth does not open even slightly when she speaks. It's like watching an expert ventriloquist speaking in slow motion. The sound seems to amplify out of her ears and nostrils, yet her mouth opens wide when she eats. I know, very weird. One day, she had a sudden brain snap and aggressively asked a Ryboltian named Anger why he wanted her to build him a 28th room for his house, given that Anger lived completely alone and was permanently bedridden with a terminal illness. Anger was outraged by Hildegard's insolence and reported it to his son. "How dare she question me?" he yelled. The next day, Hildegard was arrested, charged, and convicted of having committed the highest level of insolence. It will not surprise you to learn that the charge for most crimes under Ryboltian law is death. The level of crime merely determines how painful and slow the death will be. There is no appeals process. Insolence carries with it the most painful death imaginable. The details are simply too gory to discuss. Her death was scheduled for the next morning. Following the protocol that applied to any prisoner awaiting death, Hildegard was tied to the town pole with heavy chains, where she was exposed to public exhibition and ridicule. Any Ryboltian citizen wanting to have a little bit of fun with the prisoner were encouraged to do so. The pole was outdoors and had no trees or buildings to buffer the swirling winds that tend to sweep their way through Ryboltia late at night during this time of year. She would be guarded all evening by 2 massive Ryboltian males. They were only there to protect her from escaping, not to protect her from the marauding crowds. Ryboltians took turns throwing stones at Hildegard. Her scales were no match for the continual and brutal onslaught. She was beaten to a bloody pulp by the time the last of the spectators had left. Many of her scales were cracked beyond repair, and their blue shimmer had turned a sticky red. It was now about 2 a.m. Hildegard was only just clinging to life. To make matters worse, a freezing cold wind had swept in, so she was now also feeling the effects of hypothermia. The 2 guards had fallen asleep next to her and were snoring loudly. Their warm blankets did little to muffle their repulsive grunts. No prisoner had ever escaped before, so why would they possibly brave the cold and miss out on a good sleep? Sked looked around carefully to make sure that nobody else was present. The guards were not going to stir any time soon. Satisfied that the coast was clear, he used massive bolt cutters to release Hildegard from her heavy chains. The loud clang of breaking chains was completely masked by their vastly louder snores. Sked hurriedly carried Hildegard back to his parents' house and the safety of Fluffle's underground room. Although her weight was not an issue for Sked, she was awkward to carry because of her height. As Sked ran, her flexible frame bounced around like a limp rag doll. She hardly stirred, though. Her eyes stared blankly ahead. She was clearly in a very serious state. Fluffle was delighted to finally have some company and kept a bedside vigil. Hildegard was running a fever and he fought hard to keep her temperature down. He had little more than wet towels at his disposal, but by 4 a.m. her temperature had dropped back to normal, and she looked considerably better. Fluffle's selfless, tender care had brought her back from the brink. She desperately needed sleep, but other than that, would make a full recovery. The sleep she now craved was stolen from her as Sked suddenly entered the room. "We have to leave right now," he whispered, with real urgency in his voice.